classic whodunits to modern psychological thrillers, each episode offers exclusive insights, behind-the-scenes stories, and discussions on the art of crafting compelling crime narratives. Whether you're a seasoned investigator or a newcomer to the genre, Books to Die For is your ultimate guide to the thrilling world of crime literature.
Welcome back into the house of mystery. I'm Al Warren, and we've got Mr. Joe Goldberg here. Well, we've got a returning writer with us today, and he's got book 5 of his series. It's the Andy Roark mystery, and it's called The Judge. So we got Peter Colt. Thank you for coming on the show, Peter.
Thank you for having me. I'm really appreciative, as always.
Well, Peter, here we are again. So book 5. Do you follow your characters' changes? Is that more important in a book than the actual side story? I don't even call it side story, but you've got, like, in this story, the Boston judge being blackmailed. Do you know what I'm saying? Is it primarily based more on what goes on, what happens to your character through this story, or is it really based on the judge and how your character reacts to it?
Private eye fiction is great because the client is the MacGuffin. They're just the vehicle to get the story out there 90% of the time. It's these stories, they're told from the first person narrative, so they really are, Andy Roark centric, just same way, a lot of my predecessors have done it. Yeah, the judge, he's a character, but he's the vehicle. It really is about following the character's changes, how he goes through the investigation, and also what's going on in his life personally and his personal growth.
So by book 5, is your character, is Andy the one leading this way then? Or do you direct your character? So when you finish book 4, is what I'm saying. So you sit down, you're going to start on 5. Is your character kind of directing you where he wants to go?
In terms of the story, I usually have a rough idea, and I take that rough idea, and that's like the, as we say in the military, that's like the 6-digit grid coordinate. It gets you close, you're maybe within 100 meters, but then it's really Andy's story, and he takes it from there, and that gets us to, dialed down into almost pinpoint. What you see in this case is as he's developing and growing, the story goes in its direction, but he's also kind of moving a little bit away from his experiences in Vietnam, and so it's less Vietnam-centric. So in that regard, he drives the train on a lot of this.
Yeah, so you're hearing your character.
Yep, 100%. The character, it really it takes on a life of its own. He's based on certain experiences I've had or people I've known. There's a little bit I've taken from everything, but things that he does, the decisions that he makes are purely his, and I just put them down in words.
Hey, Peter, I'm asking maybe a couple of questions here simply to help me out because I'm working on my new character and my new story. When you're a kid, it's all on me.
Of course.
I only ask questions that I don't know.
Our guest today is Joe Goldberg.
Joe Goldberg, yeah, who's begging for helping with book help. When you're writing because I'm writing your character, how do you match up their reactions, response, growth with plot? Are you trying to create things that happen that make them reveal something as it's going through?
Absolutely.
How do you do that? How are you doing that?
So part of it is faint brushstrokes is the way I think of it. My guy grows up in South Boston. He's born in the 1940s, so he grows up there in the 50s and early 60s. And it wouldn't have been a very enlightened time. And we don't show his entire growth to get him to where he is now. Having a client who has a homosexual affair and is being blackmailed, you see Andy's growth in that he kind of, I think, remarks casually that, as a kid, his perspective would have been different. And if you know anything about the Northeast in that time, especially areas like South Boston, absolutely, it wouldn't have been a very tolerant time and place. And so in a lot of ways, it's about revealing things without directly saying them. There's a character in the story who is a friend of his from the old neighborhood who's a somewhat salty police sergeant who is, kind of like Archie Bunker in uniform, I guess. So, and that's the way I tend to do it. That's how I reveal things about the characters, is not saying, Andy grew this way, Andy did that, and did that, but through the use of dialogue and really trying to not beat the reader over the head with it.
Oh, that's good to know. How do you set up storyline suspense. I know it's not as important as a character. Got it. But something's got to happen. There's got to be something that keeps the reader wanting to turn to the next page. Certainly, it's what happens to your main character.
Sure.
But you had to plot it out. What's happening, and how do you do that? What's your process?
I sit down. So whenever I have an idea for a new Andy Roark story or any story, I write out a brief 3-paragraph synopsis, populate it with a couple of standard characters, and then that's the starting point. So, this one's a blackmail story. So I already know we have a client, we have a crime, we have a detective, and I sit there and first of all, I had to figure out how one would conduct blackmail in the pre-internet, pre-digital camera era. So I had to talk to somebody about things like f-stops and 35mm film, and a very good friend of mine helped me with that. And once you get some of the mechanics of it, for me, a lot of the other stuff falls into place. Okay, you have pictures. You have to have a meeting. You have to have an exchange of money, because that's what blackmail is about. And in a lot of ways, the action and the scenes sort of flow and they piggyback within a general framework of the story that I've sat down and thought about.
When you're doing this kind of research, how do you get into the head of, because you're writing from first person, so how is your character, how do I say this, how do you know how far to go with what you're going to reveal about your character? Because when, what his opinions are and how he judges things.
One, I try and, in all things, I try and keep it very credible. I don't want him to, the opinions he expresses, certainly the sensibilities of today are taken into account. It is not a platform to promote modern sensibilities. It is to try and show him where he is in his process in the time, 1985. So that part of it's easy. I also sit there and as I write it, if something doesn't seem genuine, or if it seems forced, or if it doesn't seem like something he would do, and I'm just doing it for the sake of making him appear better or more heroic, more enlightened or anything, then I tend to look at that and say, all right, maybe we need to tweak that. And I'm really lucky that I have an excellent set of editors. I have a very good friend who reads them initially, and I have a lot of friends who will call bull.
Oh my!
Stuff. And that helps.
Did you take this from your own particular experience?
Well, Andy is much cooler than I am. He's, former Green Beret, Vietnam veteran. He's done a lot of really cool guy, tough guy stuff. So in that regard, no, because I have not been lucky enough to do that. But some of the Army and police stuff is, certainly translates over to that. There's certain things that just aren't going to happen. I was watching, there was a popular TV show on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. And I was watching a scene in a diner where one of the characters is a former cop. And I'm thinking, as I'm watching, going, what's wrong with this scene? And this is obviously a brilliant show, tons of awards. And it occurred to me, the character who's a former cop who has a checkered history is sitting with his back to the door. I don't know any cops who would do that. And so that would be, for me, a moment, if I were writing that, I'd go, all right, I can't do this, or if I do write this, I would have to find a way to explain it. So I think in that regard, that's how things get informed when I write.
Andy, over time, book 5, you had to have built his character over these 5 books, sort of piggybacking on Al's question. Did you know where he was going, and did he, as a character, surprise you as you bounced from book to book to book, story to story to story?
That's actually a great question. So I have a general idea of where he is going. I have this, at some point in time, final novel in my mind, which I want to write, which we're not there yet, thankfully. What I wanted to show initially, the first book just started off as this very moody novel about a guy who's just grappling with the things he dealt with in Vietnam, the things he saw, a lot of survivor guilt. And as the books progress, he's moving away from that, and he's moving away from the sort of journey that people go down with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and, people who have gone through wars and the changes that come where, one day you're on a small team and then the next day you are out in the world, you're just a guy doing things, normal stuff. And so that part of it is, yes, I want to build that and show that. What surprises me sometimes is his reactions to things, at the end of the story. at the end of the novel, I have him do things that I don't really fully realize he's going to do until it's done. And in that regard, it's a surprise.
When you write these characters, like especially your main character, not so much the other ones, because you're first person and you're kind of really involved with this character now after 5 books, how much do you think it changes you yourself when you put yourself through these experiences that you're putting Andy through? You kind of make Andy face some things that you have to make yourself face.
I've had to confront my own experiences, on deployments and as a police officer, and, try and do them in ways that are healthy. And one of the neat things with Andy is, he has the luxury of not always getting it right. And he has the luxury of, he can be kind of a mess. And so that part of it's nice because, I'm a husband and a father and I have a level of responsibility that, my character doesn't. And so that part of it, I think, is interesting for me. I get to sort of role play out, hey, what if on the day when I saw something bad at work, I came home and I didn't, help get the kids on the bus, or I didn't, go to the meeting after school, the parent-teacher conference or whatever, but I, just did what Andy would do. So that part of it can be a little bit fun. People ask me all the time if I'm writing an extension of myself, and I take from parts of my life, but he is his own character, and he's his own man.
Well, you mentioned before we came online, and any author says is, I want my books to be entertaining. I want to write entertaining, whatever genre, I don't care. But you said you're pure entertainment. So what elements do you have to put into your book that the reader would expect to make it entertaining?
First of all, the story has to keep the reader engrossed. I can't write Faulkner. I can't write 800 pages or, 1,000 pages. This has to move at a certain pace. There are expectations. There are, as they say in the military, left and right range limits. On the firing range, you can't go too far to one side or the other. You expect your guy there's going to be some action. There should always be an attractive lady floating around to either be a love interest or move the story along. He's got to be tough, but he also has to be human and vulnerable. I try very hard to describe some things in great detail. If I'm setting a scene for a room or a location, and I try and describe other things with a very light touch, like physical descriptions of characters, so that way the reader can invest their own imagination in who these people are, invest in themselves. The good guy has to win. Maybe it's not always this great victory, maybe it's a pretty hollow one, but at the end of the day, he's got to come away doing better than the bad guy, the villain.
Are there things that you say, I'm not going to do that? And I won't use the word cancel, but there are certain things, are there things that you say, I just not in sensibilities or then sensibilities, or I don't want to have anybody call me up and say this? Are there things you just say, I'm not going to do that?
Sure. 100%. When Andy lives and in the culture he lives in the 1980s, certainly racial slurs would have been very commonplace. Homophobic language would have been commonplace, or more commonplace, I should say. But, in this day and age, it's really, there's no place for it, especially if you can, as a writer, I feel I should be able to describe things in such a way that you know exactly who and what a character is without having to be offensive. There are just differences, it's the time in which the books are set, how men related to women, what was considered acceptable and not acceptable. And so that also has to be taken into account. I don't view it as cancel culture or censoring. It's just, that's the challenge for me as the writer. This is the age I live in. This is my audience. And I don't want to turn my audience off, obviously. I want people to keep buying books. So it behooves me to, or any of us, to write in a way that is appealing to readers. Now, I will tell you, I don't always get it right, especially if you read the Amazon and Goodreads reviews. Sometimes people pick up the books and go, this guy's a Neanderthal, or, this is horrible, or he's whatever. And you're not going to make everybody happy.
Yeah, that was me under various aliases. Yeah. But there's a question there, and I'll jump in just with the last question. Reviews, so you read them?
The reviews?
Yeah.
I do.
You pay attention?
I want to delineate. There are two different classes of reviewer in the world. There are the professionals who, Kirkus, all the newspapers, and I've had my share of tough reviews from them, but there's always a level of professionalism. And if there's something that they don't like, they just say, hey, maybe we don't want to review this or whatever. And I appreciate that. When it's out there in the universe to the masses on Amazon and Goodreads and other platforms, that's great too, because you're getting a very genuine response. And, you put yourself out there as a writer, you're going to get bad reviews. Not everybody's going to love it. And so I think it's important to read that. Not that it's going to inform my writing, but just so I know, that this is out there. It also has a fantastic benefit in that anytime, I get a touch of ego, I got not one but two good Kirkus reviews for this book and its predecessor. And so before I get a swollen head and think I'm suddenly this fantastic writer, I can go and read these reviews that are not so great and go, all right, kid, slow down, just keep writing and you'll get there.
Well, you can always just send me an email and I'll put you right.
Well, I appreciate that. Listen, I love honest feedback. I had a friend of mine read a Not Andy project, and she was fantastic. She gave me some great, unflinching criticism that I needed. It was, never fun, but at the end of the day, when I listened to her advice and I went back to that manuscript and I worked on it, I think it ultimately made for a much better book. So, criticism has a place, and it can be a great tool.
Well, there's constructive feedback, just saying. It's critical feedback, constructive stuff, right, Al?
Yeah, it's something that, if someone comes and says, oh, listen, I really like this, but this would get in my way, like the way you phrase something or the wording or something, or there's something when someone is genuinely trying to make the book better, that's great, or trying to make the experience better, I think that's a positive spin. But when someone is just being mean and rude, then, there's not a lot to that.
No, there isn't, but I would rather know it's out there, and I would much rather read it, process it, and understand it for what it is. I remember I was listening to, I think it was This American Life many years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, pre-COVID. My first book was out, and maybe my second book was out, and this guy was a writer, and he was talking about getting bad reviews on Amazon, and he said, it really bothered me. And then I did something. I went and I clicked on that person's profile, and I looked at the books that they liked, and I looked at the books that they didn't like, and they hardly read anything in my genre, or they didn't like stuff like I wrote. And I think that's important too, you're trying to gather an audience, and you're not going to get everybody. At least I certainly won't. And so that is a very helpful thing to see. Like, all right, you didn't like my book. Maybe there's a reason why, or maybe it just, rubbed you the wrong way, which will happen.
Well, you could always go after them.
You got friends.
Yeah, come on. I mean, we could write a book about you going after people that give you bad reviews.
We could write a book about a lot of things, but for me to take it that far would mean that they own me. They've got to place real estate in my brain, and at the end of the day, they don't. It's just part of the game, and I would much rather see genuinely bad people get their comeuppance. The world's full of that.
So evil, bad. So the person that's doing the blackmailing in this book, where do you get that person from? Where do you get that character? How involved do you get in these bad characters?
I get involved. They're not as involved as, say, Andy, but they're part of me too. I think most writers would tell you their characters are sort of like their children or their creations. My bad characters are probably a manifestation at some level of my bad habits or my bad views. And then there's some age-old fantastic ones. So, my villain in this one is driven by envy and greed, which are two great motivators for a villain. There's a little bit of a past history of failure, and, kind of coming into their own through a non-traditional means rather. And, and again, I think you have to make villains just like heroes have to be credible. They have to be, somebody they have to have their vulnerabilities too.
So you mentioned also, as you're putting together the elements of an entertainment book, the need for a female character. And I think we may have talked about this last time, but how do you construct a female character? Do you have other people read them, make sure they're real? Do you have any anxiety making sure the person is a credible female character written by a guy, or does it make a difference to you?
I don't think about it too much, other than I just try not to make them, too cookie cutter, too cardboard. I'm obviously not a woman, or at least last time I checked. And, you have to be careful when you write outside of your space. Again, it's trying to stay away from stereotypes and generalizations, I think, is probably the big help. I'm very lucky in that 3 of the people who currently read these, who edit them for me, the first edit, are all women. And so, again, I'm sure there are times, I can't remember them, but I'm sure there are times where they said, hey, maybe that doesn't work, or, nobody would do this. And again, trying to write the characters, just being credible with real emotional responses to things. We all have things, regardless of gender, that make us angry or afraid. So that's where I focus on it.
Yeah, I always go back to the Terry Pratchett quote I said many times on the show. I think he's paraphrasing is, I don't write female characters, I write people.
And that's spot on. It is, in a lot of ways, with the exception of some things. I mean, romance is always going to be romance, and I really try and dance very lightly around it because, frankly, my in-laws and my friends and family read these books, and I don't want to write anything graphic for fear of disgusting them or, revealing.
Cancel yourself.
I don't want to be canceled by my
no erotica in Peter book.
Right. I'll pick a non de plume if I'm going to do that. But yeah, it really is. You're just writing characters and just trying to make them, I know I harp on this term a lot, but credible and believable. You think about how disappointing it's been. I know if you've read more than, a few books, at some point in time, put a book down and said, this guy doesn't, feel right, or this isn't what somebody would do. Somebody gave me a book once, a couple of years ago, and it was set during World War II. And this main character shows up. They said, oh, this is so-and-so from the Defense Department. And I thought, well, I'm pretty sure it was called the War Department in World War II. And then when the character takes out 2 snub-nosed Colt revolvers and gets in a gunfight, John Woo style, dual wielding them, I said, it just doesn't really work that way. It's the same thing, whether you're writing an action sequence or a character. If you take the reader out of that moment, if you burst that bubble, that imaginary bubble that if you take them out of the scene, that's going to hurt. That's going to take them away from the book. It's going to make them not going to want to finish the book. It's going to make them not want to buy your next book. At least that's my experience. I'm sure you guys have similar thoughts.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
How did you develop the skills to feel confident enough to write? Well,
I'd written in college. I think, if you go to a liberal arts university, at some point in time, you're going to write short stories. You're going to try to, if you're not, if you're in the liberal arts program. I always dabbled. I've written bad poetry for decades now that I try not to show anybody. And I think I told you this. I was on a deployment, started the first Andy Roark story, and I put it down and picked it up. And in terms of confidence about being a writer, once I finished the manuscript, I just asked a friend if their agent would take a look at it. So in that regard, I kind of fell into it. I got so lucky getting an agent really with the first manuscript the first time out. I didn't have time to stop and think about, should I do this? Shouldn't I do this? Am I good enough? Am I not good enough? For a guy who writes about a very introspective detective, it was not a very introspective moment in my life. I just kind of winged it. So maybe in that way, it is more like my character. But yeah, sheer dumb luck. And then, once you write one, it's easier. And my agent said, look, if you can write a series, that's easier to sell. And I ended up suddenly being on the hook for a second book, and then 2 more books that followed. And at that point, there was no slowing down and no going, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this, or maybe I'm not good enough. It was just, okay, I'm a writer now. This is part of what I do. What I did come away with, what was very important for me, was writing stories that I wanted to read. If you've ever been on a deployment, if you've ever done anything with the Army, you spend a lot of time reading for recreation because there's so much time, standing in lines, being in airports, flying places, and, just the day-to-day. And so, again, there's nothing worse than getting into a book 2/3 of the way through it and then losing interest or, being taken out of the story. So once I did get into the writing thing, I wanted to do it and really give my readers, the most entertaining story I was capable of. And I hope I've done that. I think I've been pretty good at it for my small fan base.
What are your social media, website, all that information?
Sure. I just launched a brand new website, which is petercoltauthor.com or .net. It was worked with this great company in Cambridge, Mass. called Author Bites, which if you guys are looking, I can't recommend them enough. Instagram and Facebook and X, I believe, are all Peter Colt Author. There's a picture of a much younger, much thinner, much more handsome me with much better hair, I might add, in a Army ACU pattern uniform, and I think my socials. There's a picture of me in a white, not quite fisherman sweater on my main website. Some cool pictures and essays about camping, and there's a gallery of pictures of me over the last, let's say, taking about a 15-year chunk out of my life in uniform. I am accessible. Anybody, I have the luxury of being because I am not Stephen King or Dennis Lehane or one of those big guys, I try and write back to everybody who emails, everybody who messages me. And again, you want to talk about connection. I don't know if I told you this. My first novel came out, and I got a message through Facebook, and it was from a guy who had been a forward air controller in Vietnam, a Covey pilot. He sent me, said, I was there. I supported these guys, and nobody writes about us. He said, this was great. You did a good job. To get that type of feedback is fantastic. That's why I love to have it out there. And like I said, anybody who writes, as long as you're not saying horrible things about me, I write back. And even if you are, I'll probably write back. Just slightly different message.
Well, there you have it. You heard it here first. And the new book, it's out now. And let's see, what can we say? It's called The Judge. It's book number 5, Andy Roark's Mystery. And Peter Colt is our guest and the author. So thank you for being here.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure, and I really look forward to it. You guys are a lot of fun, and it's a lot of laughs.
Great, thanks. Keep in touch.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.